Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to AJ108 Criminal Investigation. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. This week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 18, where we are going to take a look at drug-related crime and a little bit of organized crime. So we're not going to go too deep into the organized crime piece. We're going to spend most of our time talking about drug-related crimes itself. So a lot of content to cover. It's more than likely for sure going to be a two-parter. So let's go ahead and jump into this morning's lecture. So I'd like to begin by asking a question. Is there a correlation between drugs and crime? Now, you may be able to kind of have an idea of the answer to this by looking at the photo on the right. The U.S. Department of Justice actually has released studies on drugs and crime and whether or not there is a correlation. But I want you to kind of think about that as we look at the next slide, and then maybe you'll have a better understanding. So talking about by the numbers, roughly 45.9% of federal inmates are serving time for drug offenses. And I have a link to that statistical page that shows you a lot of different stats about prisons and inmates, etc. Now, if you were to click on one of those links, you would get this picture. And this is updated pretty well. So this is June of 2020 is when I pulled this photo out and I put it in this presentation. And of course, here's the key down here, and you can see E correlates drug offenses. So look at the number of people, 70,323, or 45.9% of the population in federal prison. So as I back up, and that's just federal prison, not any, not the other, not a state prison or a private prison or, county jail or whatever. So if I go back to this slide and I say, is there a correlation between drugs and crime? Perhaps now you have a better answer. So let's go ahead and kind of jump in with a little intro. Drug gangs have turned many communities into virtual war zone. Organized crime, which we're going to touch on a little bit, is heavily involved in that drug trade. And we do need to be aware of the response and involvement of different jurisdictional levels and those agencies involved, because we're going to work with different agencies. And we'll talk about the different responses from each one and how they work together. And finally, in most cases, law enforcement, they detect these drug problems at their lowest level because they're on the street dealing with those folks. And that opens up these larger cases, these larger investigations. So that's kind of where it all starts. So a little history, because I do think it's important that we know kind of where some of this came from. So American history is filled with drug use, including alcohol and tobacco. And as early settlers moved west, one of the first buildings in each one of the towns was a saloon. So if you watch Westerns and you're a fan of Western shows or movies, where did everything happen? It happened at the watering hole, at the saloon, where there was gambling and dancing and sometimes prostitution, but there was also alcohol. Okay, so we have to kind of, we have to think where this actually started. Now, cocaine was also common in 1880. At the beginning of the 20th century, cocaine was the drug of choice, said to cure everything from indigestion to toothaches. And it was also added to flavor soft drinks like Coca-Cola. And here's what a package actually looked like. And yes, it's delightful and it's healthful. I don't know about that, but look here. It relieves fatigue and is indispensable. It relieves mental and physical exhaustion. So, here, thirsty, weary, despondent, take this. It'll make you happy because it has cocaine in it. But we didn't know then what we know now. Now, in 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Act made buying, selling, or using certain drugs illegal. Not all of them, but certain ones. And then things started to change. And in 1937, under President Franklin Roosevelt, marijuana became the last drug to be banned. So for about a quarter of a century, the drug issues were really not a factor, if you will. Things were kind of dormant. But then things started to kind of change. So then came the 60s, a time of youthful rebellion. If you're old enough, you'll know the phrase, or Haight-Ashbury and Flower Children, a time to protest the Vietnam War, and a different culture started to kind of come about. And in 1973, as a result of this, a lot of drugs out there, etc., President Nixon declared the war on drugs. And since that time, federal spending on this war on drugs and drug smugglers and users has increased from $420 million back in 1973 to over $26 billion in 2012, and it's even more now. And again, in the 60s, we saw the resurgence of marijuana and LSD, and some other drugs. And in the 70s, marijuana was said to have been used by over 40% of 18 to 21-year-olds. And in the 80s, we started coming up with the Just Say No To campaign. So there was a little bit of a turnaround in drug use with celebrities that were advocating, hey, it's not cool to do this. Just say no to drugs. But, at the same time, other advertisements suggested that alcohol and smoking was where it was at. This is where the fun is. So this is cool, and this is what you should be doing. And in 2013, an estimated 24.6 million Americans age 12 and older, so that's about 9.4% of the population, 12 and older, surveyed, they said that they have used illicit drugs. And drug addiction and the crime that it generates was weighing heavily on American society. And it does pose a formidable challenge for law enforcement. I mean, in the United States, more accidental deaths are now caused by drug overdose than car accidents. I mean, so it's becoming, again, an epidemic. The National Institute on Drug Abuse estimates that the indirect costs of illicit drug abuse alone was nearly $193 billion, and that was back in 2012. And another kind of increasing threat is posed by controlled prescription drugs, CPDs. The economic cost of non-medical use of prescription opioids alone in the United States totals more than $53 billion each year. That's astronomical when you really think about that. And not only that, transnational criminal organizations, or they call them TCOs, street gangs, and these other complex organizations are directly involved in the transporting and distributing of different types of drugs, CPDs as well. So a lot of these entities, they're highly defined with command and control structures. They produce, they transport, and they distribute. So it's not just the low-level individuals. A lot of these larger, complex entities are becoming involved. And when you look at some of these pictures, you can see to the degree what's out there on the street that's actually being recovered by law enforcement. So, and again, there's a lot of money to be had in a lot of this. So there are a lot of challenges. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some legal definitions on what some of these things are. So the legal definitions of narcotics and controlled substances, as stated in local, state, and federal laws, they're pretty lengthy and technical. And the laws define the terms that describe the drugs, the various categories, and the agencies responsible for their enforcement. So the Controlled Substances Act, CSA, was signed into law in 1970 by President Nixon and placed all substances which were in some manner regulated under existing federal law into one of 5 schedules based on the substance medical use, the potential for abuse, and the safety or dependence liability. So they were kind of categorized, if you will, and they were scheduled. So again, laws also established prohibited acts concerning the controlled substances, and they assigned penalties in ratio to the drug's danger. Specific laws, they vary from state to state. For example, possessing a small amount of cocaine in one state might be a felony, and in another state, it might be a misdemeanor. So, again, these laws kind of vary from state to state. So the Controlled Substances Act regulates these 5 classes of drugs. And if you look in your textbook on page 583, you'll find these 5 classes, and you'll also find the schedules. So let's look at the classes. So the classes are going to be depressants, and these are and you can see what falls underneath there. And these are just kind of the more well-known ones. They're not everything, but alcohol, barbiturates, tranquilizers, GHB, Rohypnol. Stimulants would be like cocaine, amphetamine, methamphetamine. Narcotics would be heroin, codeine, methadone, Demerol, OxyContin, and Vicodin. Hallucinogens would be LSD, phencyclidine, ecstasy, MDMA, K2, and then anabolic steroids, testosterone, etc. So these are the classifications, the 5 classes, and then they're also put into like schedules. And this is the chart that's actually in your textbook, and this helps because it shows the schedule, the abuse tendency, any accepted medical use in the U.S., available by prescription, do pharmacies sell or stock it, and then any other comments. And then they have examples. Now, you're not going to agree with the first one, but let's just do it. So Schedule 1 is a high tendency for abuse. No medical use. You can't get a prescription for it. Pharmacies don't carry it. And look at the comments. There is a lack of accepted safety for use under or of the drug under medical supervision. So you have heroin, ecstasy, LSD, GHB. Now, you may not agree with this one, marijuana, but that's how it sits. So one thing I just want you to know before we move on, there's going to be a little bit of a contradiction between federal law and state law. Some states have legalized marijuana. It's still illegal under federal law. So just kind of keep that in mind. Then Schedule 2. Again, so it goes across. You have cocaine, morphine, and opium. Schedule 3, we start to kind of lessen. You have anabolic steroids, codeine, ketamine. Schedule 4, Rohypnol, Xanax, Valium. And then Schedule 5, cough syrup, etc. So that's the schedule. And you can find that on the DEA's website. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So Now let's look at a little bit of terms and legalities, and we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of drugs. So first, I want you to know that possession of controlled substances, just mere possession, is probably the most frequent charge in narcotics arrests. So it's not possession for sale. It's usually possession for just simple possession. And again, some states, it might be a misdemeanor for simple possession of, let's say, cocaine or methamphetamine, a little bit, like a small amount. And then they'll tell you what that amount is in the code. And some states, it's still a felony. So it's a little bit different, but I want you to know, again, simple possession cases are probably the most frequent narcotics charge or arrest. And as with other chapters that we've covered talking about different subjects, we're going to talk now about the classifications, the one we looked at earlier. So we're going to get a little more specific. We know that the controlled substances here, they're broken up into these 5 classes: depressants, stimulants, narcotics, hallucinogens, and anabolic steroids. So, and we're going to take a look at that. Now, I'm going to throw one area in here first. So while it's not regulated by the CSA, there are regulations to inhalants, and that's what we're going to take a really brief look at. And inhalants include things like glue or cleaning solvents or lighter fluid or paint or paint thinner, or even, let's say, those fatty markers, like those permanent markers. People can sniff those. That's why a lot of times now you'll find paint behind a locked cabinet or glue behind a locked cabinet. So there are regulations, but it doesn't fall within the CSA. And kind of a new thing that's out there, and it may not be new to you, but some people may not know about it, so I wanted to talk about it, with something called NOS. And you will find a lot of times automotive shops might illegally sell this. And the way that you might get it at a party is it will be in individual little, compressed capsules, metal capsules like this, and then you would basically take your balloon and you would put it over the capsule and you would release it and it would fill up your balloon. Or it would be like one large gas tank, if you will, and they would fill up the balloons. But you would go to a NOS party, and when you paid your entrance fee, they would give you a balloon full of NOS. And it's becoming more and more an issue as it relates to drugs and controlled substances, etc. And I have a news article, if you want to watch it, that was an undercover raid by the Rialto Police Department on an auto repair shop that was actually selling NOS. So again, just know that these are some kind of new things if you've never heard about it, but maybe you've already heard about it. But let's go ahead and look at some other ones. Okay, so let's look at depressants. So we're going to kind of start here. So what might fall under depressants? Well, I gave you a little bit of information, but the bigger ones are going to be alcohol, barbiturates, tranquilizers, GHB, and Rohypnol. And again, if you've never seen some of these items, most of us have probably seen alcohol, but GHB is kind of an interesting thing. It's a very clear liquid, or it's a very fine white powder. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the lecture. But these are typical depressants. Stimulants, the big ones are cocaine, amphetamine, and methamphetamine. As we'll learn as we go through this lecture, methamphetamine sometimes might be kind of what they call ice crystal, or it may just be a powder. Sometimes it's different colors depending upon what it's made with. Sometimes the seller will color it on purpose and make it look like rock candy because it looks cooler. Cocaine can be powder or it can be rocked, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well a little later. Narcotics would be things like heroin, codeine, methadone, Demerol, Oxy or OxyContin. And and there's different methods of use, and we'll talk about that as well. But now we're just kind of going over the classes. So you have different, heroin. You can have white or you can have brown. So you've got some different potency levels as well. Hallucinogens. This can be LSD or PCP, ecstasy, spice, or ketamine. So if you've never seen PCP, typically it can be in a crystal form, but for the most part, it's a liquid form. And the method of ingestion usually is you will dip a cigarette into the bottle of PCP, and you soak the tip up about halfway, and then you let it dry, and then you smoke it. But you can also inject it. So there are a lot of different ways to do this. And then finally, you have anabolic steroids, testosterone, etc. And this you may not run into a lot in the field. Sometimes this might become a workplace issue, but a lot of times you're not going to really run across this in the field as a patrol officer. So now let's look at some of those, again, some of the more commonly observed drugs on the street that might be in possession of users, or seized in drug raids. We're going to talk a little bit about cocaine and crack and heroin, marijuana, morphine, and opium, and things like that. So powder cocaine and crack. So crack cocaine is also called rock, and it is produced by mixing cocaine with baking soda and water. And you heat this solution in a pan, and it can be it can also be a can, but a pan is typically what's used. And then you dry it, and then it will form like a little cake. And as it hardens, you can break that cake up into little pieces or rocks, or you can cut it up using a razor blade into like little squares, or what we call rocks. And it is less expensive than the standard powder cocaine, and it's often smoked in a glass pipe, and it is about 10 times more potent than regular cocaine. So it is truly something that is addictive, and it is. I'll give you a little bit better description. It's it's described as cocaine intensified or amplified in its effects on the human body. The intense high that's produced by crack also is followed by a very severe depression time, or what they call crashing, and a deep craving for more of the drug. So highly addictive. It's more addictive than your standard powder cocaine at a much earlier stage of use, sometimes even after the first use. So again, it's a very addictive type drug, if you will. Sometimes they might even mix it. So I do have a link here if you want to see how they actually rock up cocaine. I have a quick little video. But they might mix. You see a lot of poly drug use, which means combined. So they might do something called space basing, which is mixing cocaine with PCP, and you're gonna smoke it or inject it. Typically, you're going to inject it, or a speedball, which is going to be mixing cocaine with heroin, and again, typically you're going to inject it. Now you could smoke it, but typically these are going to be things that are going to be injected. And you'll have, like with cocaine, you'll get the euphoria and the stimulant part, and then after that wears off, you're going to get the hallucinogenic part with PCP, or with the heroin part, you're going to get the euphoria part where you're going to start to come down. So you have the one reacts and then the other one reacts, but you're still going to have a crash at the end of both of these. And if you've never seen rock cocaine, well, here it is, a closer picture to add a little bit of context. Threw in a dime right here. These are photos from the DEA. So you have rock cocaine. Now we'll talk a little bit about heroin. So heroin is a commonly abused narcotic. It is synthesized from morphine and is 10 times more powerful in its effects. So it is physically addictive and relatively inexpensive. Heroin can be injected, smoked, or snorted, with intravenous injection producing the greatest intensity and the most rapid onset of euphoria, usually within about 7 to 10 seconds, and that's because you're going to inject it right into the bloodstream. And heroin that is sniffed or smoked, it's going to take a little bit longer to get into the bloodstream, like 10 to 15 minutes. But these methods, the smoking or the snorting, they've increased in popularity because of the availability of the high purity heroin. So you're still going to get that intense high. It just takes a little bit longer, but also that growing fear of sharing needles. And heroin is actually kind of on a comeback right now. We're starting to see a lot of heroin back into the high schools because, again, it is very cheap, and because it's more pure, you can actually snort it or you can smoke it as opposed to injecting it. And those two things, again, if you don't inject, you don't have those marks, the injection marks, so you're less apt to be discovered by somebody, say, looking at your arms or something like that. So heroin, it can be brown heroin, it can be the white, it can be tar heroin, which kind of looks like a little raisin. It's usually small, wrapped in cellophane, so you can see by the picture. And it's got a little bit of vinegar smell to it. So that's one way that you can detect tar heroin. So what about marijuana? So again, a lot of controversy on this, and I'm not going to debate the marijuana thing right now. We'll do that some other time. But, marijuana is made from a plant in the genus cannabis and is the most widely available and most commonly used illicit drug in the United States, with a little over 80% of agencies responding to the 2014 National Drug Threat Assessment survey. And marijuana is variously classified as a narcotic, a depressant, and a hallucinogen. And it's got some different street names, and some are new and some are old, and you may even have your own that you've heard. But like grass, pot, dope, joint, herb, Mary Jane, and yeah, these are really old, reefer, and typically just weed. So marijuana is one of the most controversial of the illicit drugs, and a wide spectrum of opinions exist regarding its harmfulness. But overall, again, marijuana is the most prevalent illicit drug detected in impaired drivers as well. Fatally injured drivers and motor vehicle crash victims. So we're not just finding drivers under the influence of alcohol. We're finding more, the prevalence is more where we're finding them under the influence of marijuana. So, kind of an interesting thing. And a lot of times we're seeing some polydrug use as well, which means it's alcohol and marijuana. Now, one of the controversies out there is something called the gateway theory. And this theory teaches that milder illicit drugs like marijuana are going to lead directly to experimentation with and then subsequently addiction to harder drugs like rock cocaine and even heroin. So, and if we're logical about it and we're open-minded, think of it like this, and it doesn't mean that it's always true, but just bear with me for 1 second while at least I give you kind of a little bit of factual information. So when you are using a drug, whether it's alcohol, smoking, well, let's go with alcohol and even marijuana. Usually, if you start off with one drink here and there, pretty soon the one drink doesn't do what you want it to. Initially, maybe it makes you a little lethargic and you get a little buzz and you feel okay, something like that. Which is the same with marijuana. Maybe you feel okay and it's kind of cool and you feel relaxed. Well, as you use it more, that one needs to be two, and that two needs to be three. You see what I mean? So the rationale of the gateway theory is that after you use it long enough, it's not going to do what it initially did. Therefore, you are more prone. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. It just means that you're more prone to maybe experiment with something harder. Does that make sense? And it sounds logical. So that's the thought process behind the gateway theory. Now, again, marijuana is made from the plant in the genus cannabis, and is the most widely available and used drug in the United States. Again, it is classified, depending upon who you talk to, a narcotic, a depressant, and or a hallucinogenic. And this is what a plant looks like, if you've never seen one. And then the other issue that we're dealing with would be what you see before you here. Now you see a little reflection because I took this picture through a window. But you see cannabis is, and sometimes the THC portion of cannabis, which is the part that gets you high, is being put in things called edibles in all kinds of different things. From cookies to mints to candies to beer to vodka to lollipops to cocoa, you name it, it's in there. And one of the things that law enforcement and parents are worried about is the fact that candy looks like candy. And what you don't want to happen, of course, is somebody that's under the age, especially a youngster, to get a hold of some of that and ingest it, not really knowing, or thinking that they're ingesting candy and they're not. Okay, so enough of the issues on marijuana. Now let's talk a little bit about methamphetamine. So methamphetamine, or meth, is now firmly entrenched as a major U.S. drug problem that really is only getting bigger. Methamphetamine is a highly addictive synthetic stimulant, which means it's man-made, okay, with a bunch of different chemicals that looks like cocaine, but it's made from really toxic chemicals like, and get this, drain cleaner, paint thinner, and other easily obtained over-the-counter products, including things like cold medicines or anything that contains pseudoephedrine. So again, it's synthetic. Doesn't mean that makes it any better, but synthetic is never good, right? And also, there's a name out there for it, crank. It's kind of a street name for methamphetamine. It's relatively simple and inexpensive. And typical meth users are sometimes high school and college students and working class men and women. And the nickname that you're going to probably laugh at, somebody called a tweaker, is basically a meth addict. And a meth cook is someone who actually produces the drugs. Now, the most common form of meth is powder meth, which is usually injected or snorted, but it can be ingested orally or smoked. And some other forms of meth include crystal meth or ice meth, and it resembles like crystal or shards of ice. And that's also usually smoked, and it's a little bit more pure, but it is a little bit more addictive as well. They have also made methamphetamine tablets, which are about the size of a pencil eraser. And those are also ingested orally or they're smoked. So a lot of different ways. And you can see these are larger quantities that are shipped. So we have some powder meth. You have some some crystal meth. And remember I told you that sometimes it's colored. So whoever the seller is might color it. This is crystal meth that's colored this really cool teal blue. You have, and again, sometimes the color is based on the product that is used to produce it, but sometimes it's colored by the seller. So you have a little bit of orange here. See, and it's supposed to look cool. Severely, extremely addicting. Okay, so that's enough for meth. What about club drugs? So club drugs are those drugs that are commonly found at things like raves, these dance parties that have that really fast-paced, rhythmic, repetitive electronic music and light shows. And rave culture also uses a range of illicit drugs. And although tobacco and alcohol are typically the most common that are found at this club scene, other substances like ecstasy or Rohypnol or GHB and sometimes LSD are very popular with young people. And methamphetamine has also been increasing at these raves. So, ecstasy, also known as MDMA, is a powerful stimulant derivative of amphetamine or speed. And MDMA is considered a moderate threat in the United States, with reported levels of availability and abuse kind of trending in the middle and maybe even a little bit down. But you're going to see this at these different types of club events. Now, Rohypnol is kind of a second club drug that's made the news in the past because the nickname is called the date rape drug. And Rohypnol is also known as roofies, and it is available by prescription outside of the U.S. Rohypnol is a central nervous system depressant, and it's 10 times more potent than Valium, so it's super strong. And the drug itself can produce extreme lethargy and significant reduction in someone's ability to recall what happened, if you will. So combined with alcohol, it causes blackouts and memory loss and you're not as quite inhibited. So because Rohypnol was originally colorless and odorless and even tasteless, it became, it was one of those drugs that was used to facilitate sexual assault. And that's where they kind of came up with the name, the date rape drug, because if somebody took it, they wouldn't notice that it was in their drink because you can't see it or taste it. And then the next day, the person wouldn't know, they couldn't remember what happened. So you can see that it's a really dangerous type drug. And it's got different forms as well. When you look at MDMA, in pill form, or even Rohypnol. GHB, this is another drug that's used to commit sexual assault a lot of times. It's got a long name. It's gamma hydrobutyric acid, but it's also called GHB for short. It too is colorless, odorless, and a little salty liquid, or you might find it in a white powder. It's taken orally. It costs about between $5 to $25 per dose. It's in a capsule, or in liquid. You get an ounce of it. And investigating cases involving GHB, they're really challenging, because investigators have actually started to refer to this drug as the stealth drug because of the difficulty in detecting its use. Because GHB also causes unconsciousness, victims may be unable to provide any useful information to investigators regarding an attack that may have occurred following the ingestion of the drug, so they don't remember because they pass out. So this is tough again. And then finally, ketamine. They call it Special K, or just K for short. This is a a prescription general anesthetic primarily marketed for veterinary use. And again, ketamine or Special K, it's sold as both a liquid and a powder. When ingested by humans, it causes physical effects that are similar to PCP. And you have visual and hallucinogenic effects like LSD. At a low dose, it impairs your attention span and your learning ability and sometimes your memory. At a higher dose, it can produce delirium. It might have impaired motor function. You might get high blood pressure, depression, and also in some cases there have been fatal respiratory problems. So, ketamine also is going to cause agitation, sometimes unconsciousness, and amnesia. So ketamine has also been used as a date rape drug. So these club drugs, again, there's a lot of dangerous side effects to them. So here's an example of what GHB would look like in a powder form or in a liquid form. And here's an example of what ketamine looks like in a crystal form. So, again, it doesn't take much. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about prescription drugs. So abuse of prescription drugs has become a nationwide epidemic. And pain relievers such as Vicodin, Percodan, Percocet, OxyContin, and oxycodone, they top the list of these different types of drugs. And if you look in your textbook on page 589, there's a lot of data, so I don't really have time to go over the data. But, some surveys have found that more than 70% of people who use prescription pain relievers for non-medical purposes, they got the drugs from their friends or relatives. So again, and a lot of people, unfortunately, they start using these drugs for a legitimate pain issue, and because they are addictive, they actually fall to the addiction, and then they have to start using more and more. But again, some interesting facts. When we surveyed a lot of individuals, a lot of surveys have found that about 70% of the individuals who use prescription pain relievers for non-medical purposes, meaning they're using it to get high, they get these drugs from their friends and relatives. And approximately about 5% of these users got these prescription drugs from a drug dealer, from the internet. Another means of obtaining CPDs is through drug diversion, either by faking, forging, or altering a prescription. Obtaining bogus prescriptions from those criminal medical practitioners, or buying drugs diverted from healthcare facilities by their personnel. Pharmacy thefts, as we've looked at earlier, are increasing nationwide to feed this growing demand for prescription drugs. And the rising cost of prescription drugs has also enticed senior citizens to join in the diversion and sometimes even sell their prescriptions. So it's kind of out of control, really. And again, I don't have the time to go through all of that, but I wanted to at least give you a little bit of information on the issues relating to prescription drugs. And then there's the over-the-counter drugs. So, a lot of teens typically in this area are turning to the legal over-the-counter drugs for getting high, mistakenly assuming that if something is legal and readily available, that it can't be dangerous, or at least it won't kill them. So these young people have their own language to describe their methods of getting these legal highs. Drinking bottles of cough syrup such as Robitussin DM to get high is called robotripping. And skittling, so named because the pills resemble small red pieces of Skittles candy, is ingesting high doses of quercetin cough and cold or triple C tablets. And perhaps the riskiest and most hazardous practice of all of this is what they call farming. And that's going through the family's medicine cabinet for pills, both over the counter and prescription, and kind of putting everything in a bowl and then scooping out and ingesting a handful and just kind of waiting to see what happens. Are you kidding me? But this is true stuff. So investigators have to kind of, again, you have to understand the different things that are happening, and what some of the trends might be. So again, if you look on page 591 in your textbook, there's a summary of controlled substances, and it will talk about the name of the drug, the nicknames of it, the usual methods of injection or the way they administer it, the effects of the overdose, and then any withdrawal symptoms. So it's a pretty cool thing. And then finally, as we're starting to finish up part one, would be designer drugs. And these are extremely popular right now, and they are extremely deadly. You can easily Google any one of these and find a video on someone that's ingested some of this stuff, and you can see how deadly it is. But you have potpourri. It's being sold as potpourri, but they're actually using it like synthetic marijuana. So right here, K2, they're smoking this. And again, it's synthetic. So it's got all of these nasty synthetic additives, but they package it to look really cool. And you can find a lot of this in what we call head shops or smoke shops. But and again, we're worried that kids get a hold of this, especially younger kids. And they're, again, the cool packaging, Scooby snacks, that's kind of cool, or K2. But they're able to sell it because they're marketing it as potpourri, not as synthetic marijuana, right? In the upper right, you have bath salts. The same thing, where they're mixing it with alcohol or they're smoking it. And it will really kill your brain cells. And a lot of people have died from using this. So look it up on the internet if you have a chance. So these are some of the designer drugs that are out there. Okay, so how do we then identify some of this stuff? So we're out in the field and we come across it. So how do we identify it? And then how do we even test it? So the sale of prescription drugs, the fastest growing category of drugs being abused, has skyrocketed since 1990, and consequently, a major challenge for police officers is to recognize and identify drugs that are found in a suspect's, in their possession. A lot of times there'll be 2 or 3 pills in a plastic baggie, or they'll have a pill bottle with no label on it, and there's some drugs in there, some tablets or capsules, but you don't recognize what they are. So because of the countless different types and colors and sizes and trade names and strengths of commercial drugs, many officers rely on a pharmaceutical reference book, and it's called the Physician's Desk Reference, or the PDR. Now, if you're old school like me, I carried one of these in the trunk of my police unit. But now, of course, they have the PDR on an app, so you can actually look it up on your phone. So that's a lot better to deal with individuals in the field, where they have these software apps that are installed on your phone, and you can use these tools. So that's actually pretty cool. We also have narcotics field test kits, to where we can test some of this stuff in the field, a presumptive test. So, in absence of a printed field guide or reference book or something on your app, a lot of these street drugs can be identified with a field test kit. Again, it's only a presumptive test. You still have to send everything to the lab for official testing to confirm it, but it's good enough to be a presumptive test. So that way, presumably what you have found is going to be cocaine, heroin, or PCP or whatever. Understand also that field testing cannot be used to establish probable cause. It's only going to confirm what you believe. It can't establish the probable cause. So here's what a test kit looks like. And they have them for everything. And I just threw up a few. So here you can see on the left, and inside of each one of these are these little ampules or tubes with liquid in it. And I can't tell you what the liquid is because I don't know. But you can see the tubes in here. And then what you do is you break one tube and you shake it. You break the next tube and you shake it. And if there's 2 tubes, you break it. If there's 3, you break it. If there's 1, you break it. And the color will indicate what you have. Here, if it's blue, it's codeine. If it's purple, which is the color here, it's heroin. If it's yellow, it's oxycodone or fentanyl. Same here. If it's, this is for white, brown, or black tar heroin. This is for like regular powder heroin. So this is a different kind. And if you break the ampules and it turns green, it's going to be white, brown, or black tar. Cocaine is going to be pink or blue. Here, fentanyl or heroin. Again, purple or the light color. So there's different brands, and you have it for marijuana, you have it for PCP, you have it for all the drugs that are out there. And it's just a field test to confirm what you might have. You still have to get it tested. Okay, so now that we kind of know how to identify these different substances, let's talk a little bit about the drug addict, and then we'll take our first break. So Congress has defined a drug addict as this: any person who habitually uses any habit-forming narcotic drug so as to endanger the public morals, health, safety, or welfare, or who has been so far addicted to the use of habit-forming narcotic drugs to have lost the power of self-control with reference to the addiction. Now, I know that's like super legalese, right? But the part that I think we can understand is we've lost control, where they have no control or self-control. They have to keep taking it. So with that said, police officers are pretty adept at recognizing and legally charging individuals who are under the influence of alcohol. And we're going to kind of concentrate on alcohol for a minute, and then we'll get into the other stuff. If they're driving, they're not always so able to recognize drug-impaired individuals. So alcohol is kind of easier. Drug might be a little bit harder. So if an officer suspects a driver is impaired, the officer begins his or her assessment by using a standard set of field sobriety tests. And if impairment is noticeable, the subject is then given a breath test. Now kind of follow along closely here. If we see some impairment, we're going to give them that breath test. And if the blood alcohol reading is inconsistent with the impairment, then we're going to need to have some expert, like a DRE, a drug recognition expert, evaluate the individual's appearance, performance on their tests, their eyes, and vital signs, using other test methods that go beyond the scope of that standard field sobriety test. So we're going to give them additional tests. So here again, so let's kind of go back because I know this can get confusing. So again, alcohol tests are easier, but drugs are harder to figure out impairment. If you suspect impairment, use the standard field sobriety tests. if you see some impairment, that you can give them a breath test. What if this breath test comes back negative for alcohol? Then that would mean the impairment is something else, right? So drugs, again, what we're trying to say is sometimes they're hard to discern. And if that's the issue, you're going to have to add some additional tests or find some additional evidence to say, hey, it's not alcohol, it's something else. Now, one of the other tests that are going to be added besides looking at someone's appearance or performance on a test, looking at their eyes, checking their vital signs, etc., is going to be this test. And the test, it's called the Romberg test. And to administer this test, the officer is going to ask the person to stand with their feet together, their head tilted slightly back, and you're going to tell them to close their eyes. And then you're going to be asked, you're going to tell the person to estimate 30 seconds. And when they think 30 seconds has gone by, they're going to tell you to stop. Now, while you're watching the person balancing, look for some clues. Look for the amount and direction of swaying. Look for eyelid body tremors. You know, the estimate of when 30 seconds has passed. Sometimes if they're on speed or something or meth, you're going to tell them go, and about 7 seconds is going to pass and they're going to say stop. If they're on some kind of depressant, they may sit there for 2 minutes before you have to actually tell them, dude, it's been 2 minutes. Does that make sense? Look at their muscle tone, any sounds or statements made during the test, the ability to follow directions. So this is a test kind of above and beyond just an alcohol field sobriety test. And you may even, like I said, you may need to get a drug recognition expert, someone that's been trained on looking at certain things. So we used to carry, and we still do, these DRE cards. They call these pupillometers. And they kind of help you to figure out what somebody might be under the influence of. So it's kind of cool. So here, major indicators. Horizontal gaze nystagmus, vertical nystagmus, that's your eyes. The pupils not being able to converge, the pupil size, reaction to light, their pulse rate, blood pressure. And then here's the type of drug. And it'll tell you. So here, a depressant, okay, horizontal gaze nystagmus, and it tells you what's going to be present and what shouldn't be present. And then you can actually hold this card up to next to their pupil, and you can get their pupil size. If it's a larger size, the big dilated one, it tends to be maybe some type of amphetamine. If it's a smaller pinpoint one, it's going to be more of something like heroin. But again, the DRE will look at everything, their appearance, their eyes. They're going to check their vital signs. They might take their pulse, their speech pattern, their pupil size, their demeanor, meaning like, are they scratching? Meth folks that are addicted to meth, they're going to scratch all the time. And then any other physical evidence like pipes or track marks or anything else. But these cards are actually pretty cool. But as an investigator, you're going to want to look for all of these different things. Okay? So with that said, we're going to kind of move into investigating possession or use of controlled substances, and what are those things that we should be looking for. So physical evidence of possession or use of controlled substances is going to include some stuff. One is going to be the actual drug, right? Or how about the apparatus associated with their use, the needle, the pipe, the person's appearance, disheveled, dirty, sweaty, their behavior, quiet, running around in circles, screaming, ripping their clothes off. And then, of course, at the end of the day, you can do a urine or a blood test. But the suspect's clothing again, again, talking about things to look for. May conceal drugs, which have been found in somebody's necktie, or the collar of their shirt, their coat, or their pants, inside of their shoes. Of course, maybe in their they have a baseball cap on and it's in the band inside there, or of course maybe just their pockets. And drugs can also be hidden in their hair, behind their ears, between their toes, and attached to their body with tape. Objects in the suspect's possession can also contain certain drugs depending upon the suspect's ingenuity, like cigarette cases or lighters or any other packages like chewing gum wrappers, even inside of pens or in an eyeglass case. So that's a place to hide drugs. And even vehicles have many hiding places, under seat covers, behind the cushions or the seats, in the heater vent, or in a hubcap, or in the glove compartment, or under the floor mat. All of these places can conceal drugs. So consider this as well. Often found along with the drugs are going to be various types of other evidence, like pipes, syringes, spoons, cotton, medicine droppers, safety pins, razor blades, hypodermic needles, and other types of paraphernalia. And then their general appearance, again, signs such as dilated pupils, needle marks, razor cuts in the veins, confusion, aggressiveness, watery eyes, runny nose, perspiration. These are all evidence of use. So think about that as we start to look at it. So the drugs themselves, like heroin or rock cocaine, and this is how they might package it in little cellophane wrappers. This is tar heroin, crystal meth, marijuana. So these things aren't that big. The packages aren't big because typically this is going to be for personal use. PCP is going to be in a little bottle a lot of times, or it's going to be a dipped cigarette. Some of the things that you'll find, the pipe. And the interesting thing about a pipe is the glass pipe you can get, kind of anywhere. This right here, this is the filter. This is a piece of a Brillo pad. Okay. One of those pads used to scrub a pan or a pot. Does that make sense what that is? And so this is the end where they'll put their mouth. They'll take the piece of rock cocaine and they'll stick it in here, and then they'll heat this up. And then the smoke goes back here. They'll draw the smoke back in. So signs that you might see as this pipe heats up, their fingers are going to get discolored. Their lips are, because you know what? This thing is freaking hot. So you have to look for other things besides the pipe. So again, the Brillo pad or steel wool is going to be stuck in there. So if you pull a car over and you see a bunch of little wads of steel wool, it's not because they've been doing dishes in their car. It's because they're using it to smoke cocaine or methamphetamine. So you have to pay attention. Here's a pipe that's recently been used, and you can see that they'll put the drug here, and then a lot of times, so there's the smoke, but these tips are going to turn black from burning, and you might even get some residue. That's what this is right here inside of the pipe. But again, this thing gets freaking hot, and you're going to start to see marks on their fingers. So you're going to want to look for that. This is a meth pipe. Typically, these are cocaine. This is meth. It's more of a bowl. So they drop the meth down inside of this bowl down here, and it's just like the other pipe. There's just no filter. And they'll light the bottom of this pipe, and then they'll suck it in this way. Does that make sense? And then again, because it's continually burnt and used, you're going to start to see this gummy residue inside there. Here's a meth pipe kind of in action, if you will. So you can see the flame down here. They're going to burn this, and then when it starts to smoke, they're going to suck the smoke in. And in a meth pipe, there's no filter like there is in a crack pipe. Using heroin or any type of intravenous type drugs, You'll see the little heroin balloons because that's how they package it. Okay. Now, if it's tar heroin, it might be packaged in something else, like a little piece of cellophane. But you're going to see needles. Be very, very careful in these types of investigations so you don't shove your hand in somebody's pocket and you get stuck because you don't know if they have some kind of other illness. But again, you're going to want to look for these types of, this type of paraphernalia. Needle marks, pretty easy to see. These are fresher. There's not really a scab or just a light scab. These are just within a day or so. This is long-term use because you're starting to see the veins are dying. The veins are blown or they're popped. Okay? This might be maybe 1 or 2 days old where you've got just little scabbies here. This is a lot worse. And here's, a fresh injection site. A lot of times you'll see them draw blood up in that syringe so they know they've got a good vein before they shove that thing down in there. But looking at somebody's arms. And then with meth users, and then we'll take a break, you can look at how somebody has deteriorated, whether it's rock cocaine or meth. You're going to start to see scabs and little marks start to come. So here, 2003, 2007. This is when they first got arrested, and this is after they've been using methamphetamine for a while. Again, 1.5 years later, a year and a half later, from this to this, it just chews your body up. From 2000 to 2004, a lot of these amphetamine type drugs kind of make you not hungry. You're more hungry for the drug than you are for eating. So you're going to start to see, and part of it, it blocks, it gets in there and it blocks your appetite, if you will. So you're not going to eat as much, and therefore you're going to start to get skinny, especially in your face. And it's pretty pronounced, and you're able to see it. Here's a year later. What a difference a year makes, right? Okay, so here's a good spot to stop. When we come back, we'll do part 2, and we'll start looking at investigating illegal sale and distribution of controlled substances. But again, that's gonna conclude our part 1 of our chapter 18 lecture on drug-related crime, and then a little bit of organized crime.